I think most interesting things happen in the places we don't expect them and places we're a bit uncomfortable and think, that's weird. That is where the magic happens. And what the city can do is you can't force it, but you can't facilitate it.
Are you interested in the economic importance of mid-sized cities? What do you think about the European Union of cities? How can governments leave cities evolve while only creating the atmosphere allowing that evolution? Stay tuned for answers from Remco Deelstra.
What is the future for cities? Do you want to learn more about them? Do you want to know how others think about them? Do you want to be part of the conversation? Then this is the right place.
Welcome to What is the Future for Cities podcast. Today, I will interview Remco Deelstra, Strategic Housing Advisor for the Municipality of Leeuwarden. We will talk about his vision for the future of cities, positive economic vibes, knowing when to act, and many more. So let's start with a proper introduction. Remco Deelstra has been fascinated by cities since childhood, especially the interplay between the physical city, the ville, and the lived city, the cité. He creates urban environments where living, working, mobility, and amenities form inclusive, livable places. As strategic housing advisor for the Municipality of Leeuwarden, Remco shapes housing futures in a medium-sized European city, tackling accessibility, affordability, and social cohesion. His expertise span strategic urban policy, area development, and neighbourhood renewal, linking housing to well-being and spatial goals. An urban thinker, he views cities as systems connecting social, spatial, and economic dynamics across disciplines. He finds innovation in the unfamiliar and draws energy from national and international networks. Since 2008, Remco has published on city making, inclusive urbanism, and housing markets, and gives guest lectures on urban development and governance. And with that, Remco, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for your time. I highly appreciate your appearance on the podcast. And let's jump right in. What does the future of cities mean to you?
It means a lot because I see that how humanity is developing itself, how culture is developing, it's connected to cities. And that means a future without cities is a bleak future, a future where humankind prospers, needs good cities. So the future of city is, I think, very important. I'm also glad that I have the opportunity to talk about it on this podcast. And there are a lot of other good voices speaking about the cities. We need to have the conversation about what is a city and how can we make a city function well in a way that is good for the people living in it, but also for the economy, but also nature. It is a focal point of humanity, the city. Catalyst for change, for new ideas, pressure cooker, but it only functions if we're paying enough attention to it and working at that it functions well. That's how I see the future of the city. And that also means that I think we have to have the courage to leave some thoughts and ideas of how a city should function or does function. We have to make sure that we're re-evaluating, that we know that we have to look back and think, is this how we wanted the city to function, to look? Or is there a better way, a quicker way, a more easier way? Because if you look at the future, there are so many big problems, but also opportunities. Climate change, more people going into the cities, there's rising differences in income, raises tensions, but also you have the new economy and new culture. So there's a balance between negative developments, positive, and we have to readapt our way of thinking and operating in a city so that we can grab the good developments and mitigate or lessen the more negative developments.
I love that you just describe cities as humanity itself and how humanity progresses and as a pressure cooker. And to be honest, I would love to see even more of this kind of reevaluation, as you mentioned, investigating how we have done things, whether we want to continue or maybe we should change some stuff. So yes, please. Before we will move on, I understand that this is the city that humanity's progress manifesting in basically physical form. But you mentioned functions. What are these functions which are present in cities?
There are a lot of functions that the city has. One that I really like is a legal function, but also a mental function that was in the Middle Ages in cities in the Netherlands and in the German lands, with the phrase, when you're living in 1 year in a city, then you were free from the feudal laws from the countryside. Because the city was literally a place to get free, to be yourself, to get new opportunities. And that, I think, the power of a city to create opportunities. And that is in a lot of ways. When you are raised or moving to the city, then you can start all over again. You can be yourself or you can be another person. You have the freedom to connect to new people, to new groups, to new ideas, new companies. So a city is a marketplace of opportunities, of ideas, and all the functions that it has, from production to education to health, culture, they're all grounded in this marketplace, this thick layer of all kinds of human opportunities that it makes. I think the big difference between a city and the countryside, villages, that's also good living. And it's not that villages and the countryside is bad, but there are just not enough people to generate those opportunities that you have in a city, because it is proximity, there is enough density, but also a kind of mindset. And I think that is why all the other functions, for example, productivity, the city is the place where the economy of a country thrives. In developed countries, if you are developing countries and you're mostly of agriculture or natural resources, then the countryside is more important. But if you have developed country, then the city is the place where you generate the GDP for a country, because all the production is in the city, the physical production of cars and all the other stuff, but more important, the production of new ideas, of services. And services are nothing else than also a kind of production, but then in the world of ideas. And that's only possible in the city. That's why cities need to function at a good way, because otherwise it loses that ability to renew itself. If you look at, for example, some cities in Northern America, Detroit, the Rust Belt, cities that lost their old function from iron and car factory, but also because it collided with the sprawl, the urban sprawl, so that the city had an industry that was losing steam and other countries were more competitive. But because the cities also weakened themselves because they're too spread out, and what makes a city is proximity, is density. And if you're in, let's say, the good times, when you're doing really well, then you can build up suburbs because the revenue of the industry that's making the money can compensate for the loss of urban sprawl. But if your industries are losing it from competitors, and you have too thin a layer of city, then you can't reinvent yourself because you're a hybrid form between city and the countryside. I think that a lot of policymakers, decision makers didn't realize how it functions and made the wrong decisions. Decisions that I can understand, because you have to have a deep understanding how a city functions. And if you don't do that and you see it from day to day, then it is a logical development that you go to urban sprawl, because everybody has a car and they can drive. And if you see driving cars, it gives the illusion of prosperity. that it is big, it's going fast, and if there are many, it raises a kind of instinct with human that, so this is important. If I see a traffic jam, this is an important city because there are a lot of cars and cars are big and big is good. So the city is doing good. And I understand that how people see that. You have division to some slow thinking and fast thinking. And I think you also have the distinction between quick and slow vision. Look at it and think, oh, a traffic jam. Oh, the city is doing good. Or can you really look at traffic jam and all the cars and then realize, oh, that's a bad thing. It isn't good. That's important, that you can look at a different way to the city. And I'm very pleased if I look at the last 15 years, I think, that a lot of new thinkers are on the stage with new ideas, sometimes old ideas, and were born again, so to speak, about the 15-minute city and complete city. Too long, I think, starting before World War II, people and the urbanists and the architects and the designers dissected the city in functions: living, working, recreation, mobility, with the idea that if you have all those functions, if the function functions well, then the city is good and you can split it up. But that's not what the city is. The city is a mix, is messy, is organic. Well, it's really a mess. Then it functions. But that doesn't mean that if it is a mess, that there aren't systems and laws governing the city. But you have to see them. If you can't look beyond your own discipline, or if your discipline is too small defined, then you can't see it. It's just being a cook, but you can only boil an egg. Then you're not a cook. Then you can only boil an egg. And that is what we have done. 10 people, and one is boiling an egg, and other is making bread. But none is coming together. So it's a collection of food, but it isn't a dish. It isn't a meal. And a city is a meal. And spicy and hot. And some things taste bad, but that is all part of the city.
Your analogy with the food, it's just really good. And yes, we need to work across those different cooks who are just boiling eggs or just breaking the bread, because then we could create a really good meal if we just talk to each other. Before we move on, I would love to understand what you think about this kind of thing I realized talking with you and talking with Francois Farmas in episode 3. It comes clear for me that Dutch people are very good at reinventing and investigating the old ways. Because Francois Farmas, for example, talked about that they are doing Amsterdam Smart City and they have been re-evaluating their smart city definition. And at the time of the recording in 2020, I think, that was the 8th version of their smart city definition, which means that they have been iterating on the smart city itself. And you just mentioned that we need the courage to reinvent and investigate how our functions work. I'm curious whether it's a trait of Dutch people generally. How is this possible? Because this is so freaking awesome that you are willing to investigate and experiment.
Perhaps because half of the country is below sea level and we're used to making land, and then the sea flooded it and we had to remake the land. So perhaps it's a part of that. And also the Netherlands is a small country and really flat. So the only interesting things we have are cities. So perhaps that's also just don't have anything else.
Come on, the Netherlands is a beautiful country. I don't know about living in it, but as a visitor, as a tourist, it's a beautiful country. Thank you very much for entertaining my question. I would like to go back to the economics part, because you have been talking about how cities are basically the powerhouse of economics. And that's not necessarily always the understanding of cities. As we discussed previously before we jumped on the call, economics and cities are not necessarily talked in the same sentence or in connection. And Professor Matthew McCartney in episode 90 also discussed this. He's an economics professor, and he just discovered at that time when we talked, oh yeah, cities and economics could have some connection, which is mind-boggling. So I'm curious, what do you think about this connection and whether you have any idea why this connection is not necessarily at the forefront of everyone?
I think that has to do with, if you're looking at Western democracies, that the city council is elected, and that means that they address the needs of primarily the citizens, because that are the people who are voting for them. And if you ask an individual in the city, what are your concerns? Then it is not, oh, I think there are not enough space for companies. They say, I'm concerned about not enough housing, or the prices are too high, or there is pollution or crime. That is where the government responds, and the civil servants also are selected on addressing those needs because the council and the mayors find that important. And also, I think that a lot of companies are very focused on their own business, what is, of course, natural, and less on, for example, an ecosystem. Or if you're a factory that makes bricks, are you concerned about if there is enough space for startups in the ET sector? I don't think that. So that is very fragmented. And in an ideal world, the government would be much more concerned about making money through the economy. I talked earlier about in good times, then you make sometimes decisions that prove themselves wrong when times get a bit more bad. I think that's also the point with a lot of thinking about productivity and where companies should be. Because if the times are good, in Western world, the times are good, a lot of people have a job and there is space so you can spread out. And it's never really a tipping point that you can point at, but you get to a different scale to spread out. You don't have enough people. The distances are becoming too big, and then slowly you're degrading your city. Nobody is doing it on purpose, but it is those collection of decisions that are perhaps the best decision for a plot size. But if you add up all the different plots, then you get the really bad decision. And I get it. The council is focused on the people, on the inhabitants. And environmental laws are also pushing in that way that we separate business from the city. So you have the central business district, but that's just offices. And everybody wants to be a bit of New York. So we have big towers. Even in a relatively small city of Leeuwarden, the sky is low. So we have skyscrapers, but not so big. All again from very one-dimensional and not good understood vision of how things function. That's also with the business parks and the industry. You separate it from the residential areas. And for some functions, that is very good policy because you don't want to live next to a nuclear plant or some other industry that makes a lot of noise or pollutants. But most industry of businesses, you can mix them in the city because we're in an economy. The most of our jobs are service jobs. For example, so as I have or you have, there's the jobs from making stuff. That's a very small part of the people do that. But what is that? There are all kinds of offices, the outskirts of a city, because they want to be next to the road. I don't know why, but they want to be on the road. But that's ludicrous. An office, you want to have that in the city, because if I look at my neighborhood, it's all housing. In office times, it is desolated. There's nobody here. Everybody's going out to work, and after office time, everybody going here. And the business parks are deserted. So that's a waste of time, a waste of space. There's a waste mostly of opportunities. You have a final record and then you stick in a groove, and policymakers, decision makers, but also people in the consultancy or even the academic world, it's a kind of tunnel vision and breaking the silo, stepping out of your lane and see it from a different perspective. That's a trait that is very rare by most urban professionals. They all have their own passion. Some are very passionate about a green city or a healthy city or the city for women. But every time it's just a small part of what the city is. I get it. Not everybody can be interested in everything because then nothing would be done. For example, in my early days when I was young, I mostly concerned about housing and I didn't look outside of the housing issue. And nowadays, I think I was young and I was a fool because you have a city, you have a neighborhood, you have functions, you have people living and working in a city. That's what it's about. And the house is just a box where they're in. That's not the issue where it's about.
What kind of economic reinvention you would like to see besides talking across silos? As you experienced, housing is just one part of the city, and you have been thinking about this more on a holistic lens. What kind of reinvention would you like to see in urban economics or in economics for cities?
I hope that in the city hall, there's more appreciation, but also more knowledge about if you want to have a thriving economy, that means several things. That means that your population must have good skills, education, and they have the opportunities, that there are not groups that are barriers between them and a good job, but also that you have proximity and density of businesses. There are a lot of businesses that are non-tradable, haircutter, and that's services that are for the people. Every city has it, but the businesses where you make your money with for paying all the haircuts and groceries, those kinds of industries and businesses, they thrive in an ecosystem with proximity and interaction. And that means that you have to have a vision as a city with all the cave cats that there are, because I don't know what kind of industry will be thriving in 10 years. Nobody knows. But you can only do your best, and your best is that you create the opportunities for businesses to start, that you have easy access, administration hurdles that you get rid of are so easy as possible, that you make sure that there is enough money for startups. For example, if I look at Europe, that's a very institutionalized economy. That means that if you have a set business, that is very fine because you can go to the bank, or if you're really big, the government will help you. But if you are starting and you want to make something new, it's very difficult because venture capitalist is very small. It's very difficult to get access to people, institutions that are making a bet on, oh, I think you're gonna make some money. And I think that the city can, with certain margins, help in that respect, making sure that you have an atmosphere. You have to have a certain of positive economic vibe in the city, that people think, oh, I see that he's starting a business and she's doing well in her own. Perhaps it is also a chance for me. So that being an entrepreneur is natural, that you see it. People are basic copycats. So if they see somebody do something, they think, oh, I think I can do that also. There are also the rare geniuses that think about something new, but most of us, normal people, we're just copycats. And that's fine, but that means that you have to make sure that there are a lot of good examples for people to follow, that businesses are being seen, not put away in faraway places, no, in your street, that you see, oh, if I walk down my street, oh, there's a restaurant. Perhaps I can be a cook, or perhaps can I start my own restaurant. And it sounds perhaps a bit childish or simple, but sometimes it is just simple. And you don't have to need higher education to think about, oh, I think it works like this.
You mentioned cities providing the potential capital for the small startups. What is the government's role in establishing this positive economic vibe?
I think on different aspects and levels, on the whole, I think the government has to send out the message, We're business friendly. We appreciate it that you have a business. And on the spatial side, that you make sure that the zoning is in a way that a lot of businesses can be mixed in the urban fabric. So if you have a small brewery or an office or a retail, you can start it everywhere. I really like, for example, the Japanese zoning system. That is very simple. I think they have 7 different zoning elements. And in the most basic one, the residential, everybody has the right to start its own business at home. Everybody. So that's why you have a lot of businesses in Japan everywhere. I think that making zoning so simple, so inclusive that you can have everywhere the businesses, then you have to have a highly educated population. And mostly education isn't the responsibility. It is mostly not the responsibility of a city. In the Netherlands, the local government is responsible for the buildings, but not for the curriculum, and doesn't give grants to students. And I think a good city have to partner up with higher education, colleges and universities, and make sure that you're a good tandem, perhaps also with business. Well, what is needed? For example, if I look at my own city, the percentage of people that have higher education is higher than the surrounding rural areas. But if I compare it to other cities, for example, Amsterdam or other cities from similar size, but more in the center of the country, the percentage of higher educated people is 10% point higher than in Leeuwarden. And that's the potential that you miss as a city. So I think that the city it's an obligation to our own population that we're doing our best to get everybody who can and will get to the education level that he or she wants. And in the Netherlands, it's also you're a student and then you're finished and then you're going to work and perhaps your company gives you some courses to follow or you do it yourself. But learning your whole life is, I think, something that you should do, because society doesn't stop when you're 25. It's constantly evolving and you have to be in the time. Otherwise, you're left behind. In the old days, it was more easy. So you could start a job and after 30, 40 years, you get a golden watch and you get into retirement. But those days are over. You have to be in the times. And I think a local government can help. For example, make sure that there are by the libraries or open universities, make sure that your own people are stimulated and have the opportunity to keep learning through their lives. And I think you have to see that in a broad way because, for example, I'm a policy advisor on housing and urban development, but it would be nice if there are a course in wine tasting, something like that, because perhaps I want to be a wine seller. So that you also make sure that people can switch from different kind of jobs because that's beneficial to the people and also to the society as a whole. Because I think most interesting things happen in the places we don't expect them and places we're a bit uncomfortable and think, that's weird. That is where the magic happens. And what the city can do is you can't force it, but you can't facilitate it. So that you have conversation because we mix people and people can exchange views and then new things happen. And that is what the city has to do. It has to be constantly producing new ideas. And then it is not bad if you have 100 ideas and 99 are silly and won't function. Doesn't matter. The one that you find is what is most important. But you only find that one if you have enough courage to stimulate the 100 ideas. But if you're afraid or you think, no, that's not for me, and the businesses have to do it themselves, or the people are responsible, it's all your own responsibility, then you don't get those 100 ideas, and then you're missing opportunities. And what I said in the beginning, a city is nothing else than a generator of opportunities.
Love this kind of facilitation of courage and generation of new ideas. It also seems that you talk more about how governments create the opportunity, but not necessarily the solution itself. The solution comes from people and from businesses, which I think is a better way than governments saying that this should be done this way, because that's not necessarily how innovation works. I would also love to know, because you mentioned Amsterdam and your own city and the countryside, how do you think about mid-sized cities? Nick Lalla in episode 348 talked about how US-based mid-sized cities need to reinvent themselves. Otherwise, they would get lost, left behind, and people would just desert them for the bigger places like San Francisco or New York or whatever. I'm curious how you think about the opportunities and options for mid-sized cities.
I think that he points at a very good problem or development. There are, of course, differences between Europe and Northern America. Europe is much more densely populated, and the cities are much older here. They have some kind of organic, natural growth, and that is more rooted, I think, in networks. And I think in America, because it is a much younger country, there are also cities that has been growing so fast. So you have cities that pop up and disappear again. But I think he's right at that small and medium-sized cities have to reinvent themselves. And I think one of the problems that we have here more in Europe than in North America is that the local governments have very little autonomy. If I look at I don't know of every country in Europe, but a lot of countries, the national government raises the taxes, collects the taxes, and we distribute them to provinces, counties, and cities. For example, in the Netherlands, about 9-10% of all revenue from a city is from own taxes, and 90% is from the national government. And that has good sides because that means that you have a redistribution, so the differences within the country aren't that big. But it also means that the national government sets the priorities. Those priorities don't necessarily are the same goals that a local government has. And I think what Northern America has experienced more than Europe, but also in Europe we have a problem, is that you have a divergence between the rural and the cities in how people are, simple said, are voting, but also the mindset that they have. The countryside is more conservative, mostly lower educated, more on the right side of the political spectrum, and cities are at the left side, which is, for example, here in the national elections in the government, but also from the provinces, those are much more conservative than the cities are. So the priorities of those don't align with those of the cities. If you have a very big city, the capital or other big, then your problems are so big, your opportunities are so big. So you have a listening ear with the national government. That's fine. But the middle field of small and medium-sized cities, they don't have those opportunities with the national government. The national government doesn't necessarily see the same opportunities or direction. And then you're in very tight fit because you want to do some, but you don't have the tools. You can't raise taxes because that's not allowed. For example, here in the northern part, we really want to have a new railroads, but we can't make it for ourselves because we don't have the money, and we can't raise the money because that isn't allowed. So we're dependent on the national government if they want to spend the money. And that's very frustrating because that means that things take a lot more time. And then again, we're missing the opportunities. I think the good news is that in Europe, you have also, of course, the European Union. And that's a bit of a counterbalance with the national governments. Because in Europe, the system is that the European Union doesn't do what the member states do, so that they don't mix up. Or the European Union is responsible or the member state is responsible. But the small and medium-sized cities and the regions are a bit between the national government and Europe. So we can leapfrog around the national government presented to the European Union. If I may make a prediction, I think that in the future, and I don't know when that future will be, that we're going to go to a European Union of cities, and that the national governments will lose a lot of their autonomy and responsibilities because of it is going to Europe because of geopolitical issues, or it's going to the cities because they do what everyday people need. So we see what is needed from housing and businesses. I think perhaps a bit like the Roman Empire. You had the emperor in Rome. You did have provinces, but that was more military. It was all cities. Cities were autonomous for a big deal. They did their own businesses, they raised taxes, and they sent it to Rome, but mostly the cities could do their own thing. I wouldn't be surprised that Europe is heading in that kind of direction. I think that is perhaps a natural state of people, because even in a city, a big city, it's more an entity than the nation state is. And most nation states are also collections, and just because some general was good at conquering, that's this size, but really your life is in the city. But again, there's a difference between people who prefer living and being on the countryside and people who live in the city. I think the people in the countryside are a bit more grounded in a region, perhaps have more connection with the nation state. And I think people in the city are perhaps more open to new ideas or feeling that they're part of a larger, perhaps global city populace.
Thank you so much for describing this mid-sized city. And to be honest, I just love this kind of European Union of cities, because I agree with you that the city can be lost across the different jurisdictions, and it would be great to allow them to decide what they need, because they do know what they need locally. And I think that this could be a big fear or concern for you, that cities don't have the necessary authority to decide for themselves. What are the three biggest fears or concerns regarding the future of cities for you?
Yeah, it was difficult to keep it with three, but I think one has to do with the whole idea of new public management, and that government is a kind of business and we're focusing on efficiency. And a city isn't about efficiency. A city that is about efficiency is a dead city. So you get the wrong policies, the wrong goals. So that is a big concern. Also connected with the narrow jurisdictions. Sometimes governments are also forced to be efficient, even if they don't want to be. And I think a second fear or concern that I have is that the policymakers, the people who are working in the city, also the decision makers, they're too much in a kind of linear thinking. So that one day it was one, and the next day it will be two, and the next day it will be three. That's not how cities work and evolve. One day it is one, and the next day it will be A, and the next day it will be four. And if you can't think and see in that way, you're missing opportunities, or you're forcing the city in a kind of developing route that isn't fitted for a city. So I think that is what I fear. It also has to do with what you can measure. And then what you can measure is what is important. But that's BS, of course. But that is how it often works. So that's a concern. And I think the last couple of years, I also think about all digital blindness. We have all kinds of new opportunities. You have the smart city, but it's really a dumb city. And you have AI, and I think there's a lot of good potential, and I think there's a lot of bad potential. For example, there's a lot of biases in AI systems, and people who are hurt by bias are the people who are always hurt by the system. Minorities, older people, women. The system is too much focused on white, middle-aged men with a good paying job. Me. The whole system is around me, and that's not a good thing. So that's also a concern. And lastly, that's the fourth, is that cities, because a lot of councils see there's new dynamics and it's going good and people is flocking to the city. And then they forgot that a city also has to have room for families, because a city isn't about students and startups only. The base of a city is families. And that means that you have to make sure that there is enough affordable housing that's big enough, and public space where a child can go on his own to school and play, and that is safe. And sometimes governments are so fixed with the hip and side of economy and development. Everybody is about Richard Florida because a creative class. But he has to write a book about the family in the city, and that is where a city is also about. So that's the fears that I have, and I see a lot of silver linings, but I'm not sure it's going to rain or the sun is going through. That I don't know.
Maybe we get back to the opportunities, because I really hope that the sun will shine instead of rain, unless we need the rain. So that's also a possibility. But I would love to understand first, you mentioned one little thing, that we are only working with decisions or linear thinking which can be measured. Measuring is good, but we can't measure everything. Could you give us some examples which we can't measure?
What is very difficult to measure is how people appreciate surroundings. You can measure it, you can measure a lot, but belonging and feeling comfortable and having an opportunity, everything that doesn't materialize is difficult to measure, because you don't know what could have been. If you, for example, have a road and there are a lot of cars and not so much cyclists, then you can think, oh, they're not cyclists. I think that the people in the city don't want to cycle. But you only know it if you're also setting up a bike lane, and then you can see, oh, people like biking. I didn't know. No, of course not, because you didn't make the opportunity to do it. So everything that isn't materialized isn't measured and doesn't exist.
Wouldn't upcoming technologies help with that? For example, with your example that here is a road with cars, or here is a bike lane with trees and more pathway. There are experiments with, for example, digital twins or VR headsets or ARs or whatever, which could show how the different spatial solutions would feel, how comfortable would they be, how much they would increase belonging or decrease belonging. So I'm curious whether you think that this is a problem which we will face constantly, or whether there is an upward trend that we are preparing technologies and solutions to measure these to help us during our decision-making processes.
Being optimistic, I think what you said, the new systems make it easier to measure the nonlinear effects or predict them. But that has to be followed up, or can only work within a system where you have gone out of the silos, where the government knows that there can be unexpected results and they don't fear those. And that if we're trying something, or for example, a department within the government tries something and it doesn't work, that they're not punished by that, but it's seen as a learning opportunity. It needs to have ownership, because we have so many silos and so many disciplines, and everybody's doing its best, but nobody is feeling has an ownership of the total area. And thinks about, hey, I don't see children on the streets playing, but I know there are families living here. What's going wrong? The people of the greenery don't look at it. The housing people don't look at it. The people who do the streets don't look at it. nobody is feeling has the ownership of, hey, but life doesn't work here.
I assume feeling the ownership or helping feeling the ownership and going across silos is a huge opportunity for the future of cities. What are the three biggest opportunities regarding the future of cities for you?
Opportunity, I think, is that you change the way that you're looking at the city, but also managing the city. Managing less, letting things go, try to learn on a different time scale, sometimes very short time scales. Tactical urbanism, for example, I really like it, but that's not enough. You can't have a city with only tactical urbanism. That is a mess and not a good mess. So you have to have the people or the systems that look at the different time scales, that know that sometimes things need some time to grow. And in the meantime, you have a loss, but that isn't bad because the benefits will come. That the predecessors will reap those benefits from going from control to cultivation, to cultivate the city, and integrating the different disciplines. And that if you have a good house that is secure so that people can't be evicted and they know they can pay it, and it is a healthy house, then the people will be healthy. And if people are healthy, they have more room in their head so they can go into school, they can work. And there's all kinds of benefits if you're going from silo to silo and trying, when it is possible, to integrate, but also not to always integrate everything, because then it's a kind of gridlock. Then it's too complicated and nobody understands a bit about how it works. So I know it's a difficult path, the Goldilocks between silo and total energy. Somewhere in between, you have to look and try to create that. I think perhaps a kind of salvation, that if you know that if you take a bit of a distance as a civil servant and as a government, and believe me, that is very difficult, but take some distance, not too active, then the city will heal itself. Opportunities will bloom. If you want to have a nice meadow with all kinds of wildflowers, you don't have to mow it every day because they won't grow. So you have to know when to interact and not, so that the city in itself is a very powerful, it's not a fragile something. Because if you look at cities, even with 80 or 100 years of functional city nonsense, and still the city functions because it is so powerful of phenomenon. And that is comforting, because even how silly and destructive we sometimes are, most cities will heal and reunite. But sometimes, if I look at North America, it takes a lifetime, and that's not nice if you're living in the city that's going down. But if you can look at the bigger time scale, they will emerge and they will reinvent themselves. So that is, I think, a bit of a comforting notion of cities. So I'm very optimistic.
Which comes clear, and it's awesome, because we need this kind of thinking of positive outlook with experimentation, also acknowledging that those kind of things need to be run their course, and then we can learn from them, even if it's not successful. Remco, you have been very generous with your time and answers. What is your role in establishing the future of cities?
I have a double role. For example, I'm, of course, working in the city of Leeuwarden, and I try to implement all the ideas that I just talked about in my work, trying to integrate the different visions, but also knowing that sometimes you have to make decisions that aren't nice, because telling people, my boss or the people, that we can do everything and nobody's going to be hurt, everything will be okay, that's not the truth. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions. I prepare the tough decisions because I'm just a policy officer, but I try to make it understandable, that people can see it, that they know what the trade-offs are. That's one side. And the other side is looking at opportunities. That, for example, in the city center, we abolished the minimal parking norms. and that ignited a housing boom. So we got a lot of new houses in the center of the city, almost with no trade-off, because the people who went to the city and live there, they know they can't park their car. The people know that if they buy or rent a house there. So kind of trying to look at it a bit different, bit out of the box, I don't think, but let's say expanding the view. So that is what I do within the municipality, and talking to people like you and reading, contributing to the discussion about what cities should be, can be, how they function. It's a very exciting time to be alive because there are so much smart thinkers who share their thoughts and writings with the world. It's very nice. And if I see something or I read something and I'm enthusiastic, then I want to shout it out to the world. And that's what I do in LinkedIn and podcast and something like that. So that's my role.
And please keep up this role, because you just mentioned abolishing mandatory parking and you said, yeah, it's not out of the box thinking. It is out of the box thinking because many cities are struggling, let's put it that way, with this kind of thinking. So yes, please think about these solutions and how to integrate the improvements into the city system. Do you have any closing comments or requests for the audience?
I talked a lot about opportunities and I really believe in that. But I think you have to have attentive cities. That's not only the professionals who are working in the city, but also the businesses and the people being a bit more attentive, listening to what is happening, to the rhythm of the city, what people doing, expanding your vision, but also in a kind way. That is what I think is needed. And listening and caring for others isn't something passive. It is a very active mindset, because it means that you want to make not only thrive yourself, but also other people in your community. And that is in the core, I think, the strength of people. That is why we flocked to cities, because we want to thrive as humankind. And that isn't all about competition, and it is not a zero-sum game. Being attentive to yourself, to the surroundings, looking over the horizon and know that there is a lot more than that you can see, but you can see it if you travel to it, or if you're listening to people who've been there and you have an encounter with them. So I think that is very soft, but it's very important.
Thank you so much, Remco.
It was really interesting to hear from Remco about his conviction that sometimes governance need to leave the cities alone to evolve and not interfere, not to mention his description of experimentation and its crucial role for the future of cities. Frans Anton Vermast presented the same Dutch experimental approach to Amsterdam Smart City in episode 3. You can find out more about Remco online, all the links are in the show notes. What was the most interesting part for you? What questions did arise regarding Remco's approach to the future of cities? What have you learned from this interview? Let me know on Twitter at WTF4Cities or on the WTF4Cities.com website, where the transcripts and show notes are available. You can also subscribe on the website not to miss any new episodes and leave some feedback. I hope this was an interesting interview for you as well, and thanks for tuning in.
What is the Future for Cities podcast?